In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro covers a wide array of pressing issues, including a controversial shooting involving an ICE agent in Minneapolis, the subsequent political and social fallout, new executive orders from President Trump related to housing and military pay, and a detailed look into a covert U.S. military operation capturing Venezuelan dictator Nicolás Maduro. The discussion also delves into civil rights concerns in New York, the rising tension surrounding immigration enforcement, and scrutiny of defense contractors' practices. The episode begins with an in-depth analysis of a shooting incident where a 37-year-old Minneapolis woman, Renee Nicole Good, was fatally shot by a federal ICE officer during an immigration enforcement operation targeting Somali immigrants with final deportation orders. The woman's vehicle reportedly blocked ICE agents' vehicle, which became stuck in the snow, and as officers attempted to move the vehicle, she allegedly accelerated towards an officer positioned near the front left of her car. Multiple camera angles show a flashpoint moment where the officer fires 2 shots through the windshield, fatally wounding her. The central legal question discussed hinges not on the driver's intent, but on whether the officer reasonably perceived an imminent threat of serious physical harm. Legal expert Andy McCarthy is cited, underscoring that if the officer reasonably believed he was about to be struck with a deadly weapon, a car in this case, then the use of deadly force was justified under Fourth Amendment standards. The discussion stresses that intent to harm is irrelevant. What matters is the officer's split-second assessment of risk. Federal statements from the Department of Homeland Security and President Trump framed the shooting as a justified act of self-defense amidst attempts by protesters to obstruct ICE operations. The escalating rhetoric against ICE by local political figures, including Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, is critiqued as dangerously inflaming tensions and undermining law enforcement efforts. Protesters' confrontations with ICE agents, including attempts to disarm officers and physical aggression, were highlighted, illustrating a hostile environment that increases the likelihood of violent outcomes. The episode warns that inflammatory language from political leaders and media amplifies hostility toward ICE, leading to more dangerous encounters. Democratic figures in Congress have responded with calls to restrict or defund ICE, which the host characterizes as politically motivated and potentially harmful to public safety. The podcast explores the heated political fallout, with Minneapolis's progressive city council embracing more radical elements, including members of the Democratic Socialists of America assuming key leadership positions. The growing radicalization of local governance is mentioned as contributing to the tense environment. Democratic politicians' responses are critiqued for exacerbating the problem by encouraging protests and dressing them as patriotic duties while undermining federal law enforcement. This is positioned as a recurring and dangerous pattern, with a history of welfare fraud and immigration-related issues in Minnesota fueling broader political discord. Discussions include testimony from local reporters on the ground amid protests characterized by angry chants and confrontations, along with official statements condemning political rhetoric that vilifies federal officers. The episode underscores the importance of letting investigations proceed without premature judgment and cautions against reactionary responses that fuel further conflict. Highlighting a linked issue, the episode touches on welfare fraud prevalent in certain immigrant communities, particularly among Somali households in Minnesota. Representative James Comer and others express concern about the high percentage of Somali immigrants relying on government assistance even after many years in the U.S., framing this as a political vulnerability for Democrats and an important topic for Republican messaging. Criticism is leveled at Democratic officials who allegedly dismiss the severity of welfare fraud accusations and accuse them of trying to politicize or minimize the issue, which the podcast argues further alienates mainstream voters. A recent op-ed cautioning Democrats about the risks of ignoring or downplaying fraud is cited to illustrate potential political consequences. Ben Shapiro interviews Har Dillon, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, about investigations into potential civil rights violations by the New York administration under Mayor Eric Adams. The focus is on housing policies and the appointment of a tenant advocate with a history of advocating racially discriminatory views that target white property ownership. Hard Dillon explains that the Justice Department is vigilant against any illegal racial discrimination in housing, veterans' rights, and credit laws, emphasizing a zero-tolerance stance on policies that favor one racial group over another. She outlines legal standards for investigating such discrimination, noting that explicit statements by officials can help infer intent and inform enforcement actions. The conversation shifts to recent executive actions from President Trump aimed at addressing domestic economic concerns. One order targets rising housing costs by proposing measures to prevent large institutional investors from buying up single-family homes. The podcast critiques this policy as ineffective and unsupported by data, noting that institutional investors hold a small minority share of the housing market and that restrictive land use policies and zoning regulations are the primary drivers of affordability issues. The episode elaborates on how large corporate home ownership in many markets actually increases rental availability, which can ease cost pressures. Evidence from think tanks like AEI suggests banning these investors would have little impact on reducing prices. Another executive order addressed by the president involves limiting executive pay in the defense industry, especially amid criticism of slow delivery of military equipment and high shareholder dividends. Ben Shapiro critiques this populist move, arguing that executive compensation bears no proven link to company inefficiency, and that a more effective approach would be incentivizing competition among defense contractors rather than imposing arbitrary pay caps or restricting stock buybacks. He also mentions President Trump's call for a significant increase in the military budget to strengthen U.S. defense capabilities, an opinion the podcast endorses given the declining relative military expenditures in recent years. A highlight of the episode features Mary Margaret Olohan, Daily Wire White House correspondent, discussing the investigative documentary How to Take Out a Dictator in 88 Minutes, which details the U.S. military's clandestine operation to capture Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. Mary Margaret breaks down the precision, planning, and execution of the raid, which unfolded in under 90 minutes under cover of darkness. It involved months of CIA tracking, cyber operations to disable Maduro's power and air defenses, and Delta Force commandos who trained extensively to infiltrate and capture Maduro at a fortified compound. The operation drew parallels to the killing of Osama bin Laden as one of the riskiest Special Forces missions in recent history. The documentary employs graphics and first-hand sources to reveal how various branches of intelligence and military units coordinated seamlessly in this mission. The documentary underscores the unparalleled American military capability and strategic reach in the Western Hemisphere. Throughout the episode, Ben Shapiro provides his interpretation and commentary, often critiquing left-wing politicians, media figures, and activists for what he views as irresponsible rhetoric, political posturing, and danger-inducing exaggerations. He highlights statements from figures like Jimmy Kimmel and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that frame ICE as a paramilitary enemy, arguing that this incendiary language endangers officers and worsens community tensions. Conversely, he praises calls from some moderates and Republicans to allow legal processes to unfold without bias, and warns about the consequences of politicizing law enforcement actions. The episode also reviews Democratic lawmakers' reactions, including threats to block funding for Homeland Security and ICE amid the controversy, which Shapiro characterizes as politically self-defeating moves that endanger law enforcement and public safety. He references predictions that unless rhetoric and policy shift, violent incidents targeting ICE agents are likely to increase. Further, the growing progressive control of Minneapolis's city council is discussed as indicative of rising radicalism in urban governance, complicating efforts to manage immigration law enforcement and community relations. Experts interviewed and cited in the episode generally agree that legal justifications for the ICE officers' use of deadly force rest on the objectively reasonable perception of threat, not on proving the driver's intent. The Fourth Amendment and federal law allow officers to defend themselves when facing imminent danger, including from a motor vehicle used as a weapon. The episode stresses the importance of judicial restraint in assessing on-the-spot decisions made by law enforcement amid rapidly evolving and dangerous situations, calling for patience as federal investigations proceed. The podcast underscores the critical interplay among law enforcement, political leadership, media narratives, and public reaction in shaping the fallout of controversial incidents such as the Minneapolis shooting. It highlights the broader implications for immigration policy, civil rights enforcement, housing economics, and national security initiatives, weaving a multifaceted picture of current U.S. political and social dynamics.